So how has your approach to solving problems that you're having led you to developing social tools for the enterprise?
So I had worked on the early concepts around before Chatter was Chatter, the concepts of leveraging social tools into the enterprise to help with collaboration and what it would do for the organization. And so the way the concept really came about was that I was looking at my own problems. As someone who would run engineering teams, run technology and product organizations, I was trying to figure out a way of basically improving collaboration among the group. And at the time, this was 2007, late 2006, 2007, started to play around with these concepts of leveraging, at the time, it was Web 2.0 tools, Web 2.0 concepts inside of the enterprise. At the time, the biggest, there wasn't really social media. There was Friendster and MyFace, I think, were probably the two big sites that really were pushing this stuff. But there was things like Delicious and Dig and a handful of other collaborative kind of group sites coming up. And so that was the beginning of it, right? The beginning of this thought process, this progression of thought. And so it started off by saying, okay, we have a problem. Our problem is I'd like to communicate with the organization in a better way. Then it was, let me start leveraging these concepts or tools that are in the consumer space. This was, you could say, is the consumerization of IT or consumerization of the enterprise, right? Bringing consumer concepts into the enterprise. 20 years ago, it used to be the enterprise driving concepts back out into the consumer space. That time has come and gone. Now it's the consumer space is now really driving the enterprise as a whole. And so this was a great example of that. Looking at all these different cool technologies that people were using at the time, they were cool in 2006, 2007, and saying, well, how could I take these concepts and bring them into the enterprise? How do they change? Just simply taking something and dropping it into the enterprise doesn't mean it's going to work, right? What's different about them? And then as we started to go a step further, started to look at concepts of social bookmarking and feeds and the concept of a corporate social network, which is a really interesting concept. And the more I thought about corporate social networking, I started to sit there and play around with the idea of, well, is a consumer or personal social network the same as a corporate social network? And it turns out I was saying, well, no, it's not really. In a personal or Facebook style, a social network, a personal social network, your nodes inside of that network is individuals, right? They're individuals connected to other individuals and so on and so forth, right? And that becomes the web of network. In the corporate world, it's a little different because, we're all allowed to be friends with each other at work. It's work, right? It's to get our jobs done. We need to be able to interact with people. So it really doesn't matter that I'm following or that I'm friends with somebody. So that concept really doesn't apply anymore. So you say, well, how do people gather in corporations? Right? They usually gather around in a team orientation or a project orientation, or whether it's an account team that's that happens for a period of time, or it's a R&D team or a project team or a marketing campaign. Right? These are people who are actually organizing around units of work. So the nodes inside the corporate social network are not people. It's actually increments of work or teams or groups. Right? And so now all of a sudden, okay, if you look at it that way, well, that's a little different. That's not the same exact thing. And so if that's the case, well then what should we do? What's the next thing? And so I started down the path of saying, okay, well, it's all about the team. The team is the increment. And then the teams are connected by people. And then of course teams could be, then we started saying, okay, well, it's not teams, it's groups, because teams really imply something. There's so much baggage with that term. And so you can see the kind of how it progressed over, and then it was about groups. And then we said, well, it's just about groups. Well, it is about groups, but it's also around increments of data possibly, or increments of work, right? And so a group is not the only increment of work inside of a corporation. There's also data. So in Salesforce, there's an opportunity. That's a group, but it's also really, it's an increment of data. So why wouldn't there be a social network around that? There should be. And so my corporate social network is really about all the different people that I've touched and worked with around these different nodes, right, that represent the different pieces of work or gatherings inside the company. And then those concepts were then taken. Then a handful of other guys, the product team, basically took that and they made it very real. They took it out, and it was obviously a big success. And it's funny. I feel like most people have not internalized like what that really means. Even today, it's always like, oh, Facebook for the enterprise. It's not that simple, right? If that's all if you're just giving it that headline, you haven't given it a lot of thought on what it really means, right? So what was interesting about it is that all of a sudden, if you have this network and you have this concept of data, of people organizing around groups and teams and data and opportunities and things of that nature, well, what's the next thing that happens? Well, all of a sudden you start to flatten the organization, you flatten visibility. Now these silos of groups are starting to disappear. Okay, this is anarchy and a command and control hierarchy that's existed in corporate culture since the 1940s. Now all of a sudden it's, everyone can see everything. There's middle management is under attack, right? You could argue, because if they're just simply brokers of information, then they might be, their jobs could be in a little bit of jeopardy. And so, and that's not the goal of it, but it's kind of a side effect in some cases, that if you're not contributing value at different tiers, you kind of all of a sudden there's more visibility into that. So, which is interesting, right? And in addition to that, you start seeing people who were maybe contributing and stuck in a silo, but really strong contributors begin to elevate, because then they have corporate social cred, which starts to increase, which is very similar to the consumer concept of social cred. But people get paid off this, or maybe they should be getting paid off of this, right? And all of a sudden you get a guy who's a power broker, an information broker. He may be some random guy in the organization that he's not a manager, he's not a VP, he's nothing. He's just some random guy who's just really smart, and everyone knows he's smart, and all the people who, everyone's connected to him. Yeah. Well, wouldn't it be good to know who that person is? And wouldn't it be good to maybe reward him for his job? And of course, if that person ever left, knowing that hole in the network would all of a sudden, would exist. That's another difference between the corporate social network and the consumer social network, is that you pull one of these guys out or a node out of this thing, some of it can fall apart, right? Yeah. You have passive communication that can fall apart. So there's really interesting effects that happen during this path kind of progressing. And it all started from, hey, how do I run a product organization better? That was the beginning of it. That was the original problem that I was trying to solve. It wasn't even that elegant or grand, but the end result was something that I think is quite transformational for the corporate environment.